Central bank digital currencies. Where is Australia heading? Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, welcome back Matt, who's been further exploring central bank digital currencies. Is something we've discussed before, but how they're potentially going to be implemented here in Australia, in our context at least, as well as how it might all play out in terms of impacts and consequences. How are you going today, Matt?
Good, thanks, Tipper. How are you, my friend?
Very good. Now, always a controversial topic, and understandably, like when people hear about the potential of central bank digital currencies, they immediately think, the experiments that have gone on in China, for example, where it's potential for people to cut off your supply of money, and there's lots of issues. But let's step back a little bit from that to begin with, and if you could just step us through what it potentially is going to look like here, because from what you've written earlier in the week, I don't think we're necessarily going to do it the same way as what everyone else is doing.
Yeah. So there's a few considerations, and I think if we can kind of clear the air and maybe get some perspective for our Australian friends. So Australia came out not long after we actually had our discussion. There was some news that came out that Australia is looking to do a wholesale. The Reserve Bank of Australia is looking to do a focus on the wholesale CBD side of things, as we discussed in our previous chat last week, not so much the retail side of things. So the project is called Project Acacia. And Australia is actively observing a lot of other central bank digital currencies on a wholesale level going on around the world, a lot associated with the Bank of International Settlements, which has its project Enbridge, which is being tested amongst about 4 or so different Asian banks. So Australia is an active participant, an active observer in that experiment or proof of concept. So we're looking at a central bank digital currency on a wholesale level, our focus, possibly within the next 3 years. So it's not rolling out tomorrow. So if we can kind of allay people's fears and concerns a little bit there, this is the news that's coming out from the RBA as of last week. I think the concerns and rightful concerns that people should have is on the retail side of things, and that doesn't seem to be part of their priority at the moment. But if people are able to educate themselves on that retail side of things and indeed have a voice with their politicians or anyone like that, if something like that does come into place, it seems like we have an amount of time before it does to really get that in place that it might protect our privacies and liberties and so forth. But it appears though we have time for that. So keep on the
And
front foot though.
and that makes sense. I think that as a country, that makes sense that we, slow and steady in this, which is obviously a huge change in the way things operate. So it makes sense to do it that way. When you talk about wholesale, if you can maybe dig in a little bit more into what that actually means, because my understanding would be it would be between banks, between central banks potentially, that cross-border payment side of things that is now quite clunky when banks interact with other banks. Is that your
Yeah.
interpretation of what this wholesale CBDC would look like in the Australian context?
Yeah, so it would be between central banks and possibly very large banking entities that have got multinational offices around the world that they'll be dealing in these CBDCs. So currently, you mentioned that there's a clunkiness. Well, yes, there is, and clunkiness is around the correspondent banking. It's around the liquidity provision. It's about your bigger banks such as your Citis and your JP Morgans sitting at the top of the pyramid, collecting fees along the way. It's also got parts and parcel of it that, and in recent times, is starting to come to light, especially in light of the Ukraine and Russian conflict that's going on, is that the US sometimes uses that system to weaponize and sanction and so forth. So there has been a lot of talk about Project Enbridge, which is the Bank of International Settlements version to be able to still exchange money and so forth between various countries, which is an interesting, and that's a conversation for another day. But you're looking at multi-trillions. I think the world has something around about, this was figures from a few years ago, $155 trillion that was being globally sent around the planet. Now, there were massive fees associated with that. Now, a CBDC where you've got large value being exchanged between central banks themselves or very large banks, such as like a JP Morgan to another JP Morgan somewhere overseas. They're looking for that efficiency. They're looking for that cost saving, and something like a wholesale CBDC could sit in there quite nicely. And those savings could be then capital that's reallocated somewhere else and used as other investment. So it has merit as far as the wholesale side of things.
And I can appreciate that the difference there is quite significant. I'm interested also because you talked about this in the article that there's private firms really coming to play here. That you've got, which makes sense, right? You don't necessarily want the best tech. The technology is not necessarily developed to the best standard or innovation or anything like that when it's not coming out of private investment, private industry. We know that there have been some significant players in the space. I mean, I know you're passionate about the role that the Ripple ecosystem plays, for example. Is there that cross section there? Is it likely that we're going to see the interplay between blockchains as we know them and blockchains that we're already familiar with playing a role in these CBDCs, or are they starting from scratch? What's your view on that? How do they approach it from that angle?
Yeah, so you've got you obviously got central banks that I'd like to think they're not government. Some are still sort of government in their pockets and so forth. They're not, governments generally aren't great at creating anything. So I think the private sector is going to have a really important role moving forward here. And I think that's where Ripple has developed a lot of relationships over the last 7 years. I think you could probably go back to 2016 when things were starting to really, conversations were happening and proof of concepts were happening. So this has been a long time coming. Quite frankly, banks move very slowly. So it's of no surprise that this has taken forever to happen. But a lot of agreements have to be entered into, and a lot of cross currents with, the cause and effects of things around the planet with regards to finances and how this interplays with that and how it impacts that. All that has to be considered. Ripple have positioned themselves. There are a number of YouTube videos which you've got leading executives within Ripple saying that they have 10 or more relationships with central banks. You've got others that are suggesting somewhere between 40 to 50. So they're looking to really get in there as a rail to be able to move value. And I think that they've got a lot of trust with regards to those central banks to be able to move their value securely and cheaply and efficiently across those rails. Do we know all of those at the moment? No. There's a lot that I think the CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, has mentioned that they have mentioned a few, and those would be the likes of Bhutan, Colombia, Montenegro, and as we mentioned the other week, the Republic of Palau. Those could be important first steps, very small steps, but there are a lot that he's mentioned that they haven't come out and made public. So I think there's a lot of building that's been going on in the background that, quite frankly, we're not privy to. But I think that relationship, the private sector is going to be very, very important with this moving forward, especially with a proven track record that blockchain itself has had over the past 15 years. In the case of the XRP ledger, probably since 2012. So that's what, 12 years. So yeah, it's very important, and they are they are kind of moving forward with this as fast as central banks will allow them, because there's a lot of there's a lot of agreements that have to be entered into. So it's not surprising it's taking time.
And arguably, again, that's probably what you want. You don't want to rush into something like this when the consequences could be quite significant.
I think there's also some other aspects there. Is that some other important? So these small scale experiments, I suppose, your Bhutans, your Colombias, Montenegros, and Palaus are important. But Ripple is also looking at some connections there with the Digital Pound Foundation, US Faster Payments Council as well, and the Digital Euro Association as well. So those are some big entities. I'm not saying that they're going to be using the XRP ledger or anything like that, but they're definitely in there in an advisory role.
And the elephant in the room for this for a lot of people will be, even if they buy that, okay, we're talking about wholesale here, that probably isn't a huge issue because that's between banks and more efficiency. Probably most people agree that that's a good thing. Does that effectively open the door to Australia eventually adopting a retail central bank digital currency? Is it opening that now? Is it a flick of a switch effectively then, and we now have the rails to make it a retail central bank digital currency with the concerns that people have not necessarily been addressed?
I think it's a step-by-step process. And I think it's important to understand that a lot of countries around the world have been doing or upgrading their domestic services, banking services, with what's called a real-time gross settlement, or an RTGS. Sometimes it's called RTS. With Australia, it's called the NPP, which is the new payments platform. So we're getting those very fast efficiencies domestically so that we can send value from Perth to Brisbane through this bank to that bank. It doesn't matter which one, and it happens very instantly. And that's really important, because when you then start to look at the bigger picture where countries interplay with each other or interact with each other, you don't want something being super duper fast light speed coming from America, hitting the shores of Australia, and all of a sudden it lands in mud and it can't go anywhere and it doesn't do anything. What's the point? There is no point. So what's been happening over the last few years is these domestic situations or domestic solutions have been put in place. America has just recently done that with, I think, the Fed now. You've got these things in place so that then when these larger ones plug in from America to Australia, let's say, that pace continues into the domestic. So it lands and then immediately goes out to where it needs to go. So we kind of got that system already in Australia. I don't think there's a real need for us to then push into a retail CBDC and get the efficiencies. We're kind of getting that with the NPP as it is already. Right. I'm not a fan personally of a retail CBDC. I don't really think there's a need for it. However, again, everyone needs to do their research with that and speak to their representatives and voice their opinions on that one.
And last question, thinking into the future, whichever way we go, whether it's a wholesale, retail, a combination of the two, variations, because we're sitting back and watching, which is the right thing to do probably. What do you see as the longer term benefits or consequences to the banking system and that stability as a whole? Does it ultimately upgrade? I mean, you mentioned we're already doing a lot of that work. We spend a lot of money to improve our system. Is this where we're heading into a world that it is actually better, in quotes, for everyone to have these proper, fast, efficient rails where there just isn't the issues that we currently have with that clunkiness being the way we were using before?
Yeah, you look at connectivity. I mean, Australia needs to be connected to the world markets. And, if it's taking days for capital from us or investment to flow overseas to be able to then be cleared somewhere else, this efficiencies are going to be fantastic for Australia. And that might be, let's say, settlement for goods that we've sold or exported overseas. Suddenly those settlements come back into Australia a lot quicker and faster, and that capital can be deployed. So on that, and if that's the case, then potentially our citizenry can benefit from that as well, where capital is redeployed, reinvested, jobs, and so forth. We need to be plugged in, and I think Australia is taking quite a sensible step in sitting back, having a look how this plays out over the next couple of years. Being an active observer, as I said, in the BIS's experiments. I think with our NPP local domestic payment platform, we're quite well positioned to be able to then take advantage of an international plugging in, so to speak, the flick of the switch, as you mentioned before, in which we could benefit, especially like in trade export and in imports.
Fantastic explanation. And I think hopefully, well, for me at least, it sort of calms those fears that initially come up about, are we going too fast? I mean, I think you answered that today, that we're not, at least at this stage, but still we can approach it with healthy skepticism and concern, but there's nothing to be too fearful of at this stage in how the Australian government's approaching it.
We should still be on our toes. We don't need to go to where, the Chinese system and social scores and so forth like that. I'm not saying we're going there, but I think to be aware and if things like that are really being pushed, to really know that there are some safeguards that can be put in place and should be put in place to protect our liberties and our freedoms and our ability to transact anonymously with each other if we so desired.
Fantastic as always, Matt. Thank you for your deep dive on that today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tipper.
Thanks everyone for watching. We'll chat again soon.